This
Yeah, the Terry Park is.
yeah, that used to be owned by Thomas Edison, and Ty Cobb played there. They said was one of the big interesting things about that field. Okay, I got a note saying we're being recorded.
Yeah, I think we'll get going here, Al. Al, honest Al Star.
Stare.
Honest
Yeah.
Al. He's one of the umpires in the vintage baseball world. First umpire with the Orphans, and since '07, he's been affiliated with the Springfield Long Nines, umpiring games throughout the Midwest. Yeah, he's an avid student of the early years of baseball, like pre-Civil War baseball. And I saw Al 2 years ago when he was up here for the Edison Ford Winter States Baseball Festival. I saw your talk on umpiring at the Estates, and then you were kind of the master of ceremonies umpire during the game. So that was really. I was in the stands then. I wasn't a ball player yet. We hadn't formed our team down here, and just looking at the folks around me in the stands, they really they were entertained, but they also got a lot of background that made them understand what was happening out in the field. So, that was a brilliant job. So thank you for participating in the conference and talking with us. And so take it away, Al.
All right, well, hello and welcome. My name is Honest Al Stare. Greetings from Central Missouri. I am a sideline interpreter and umpire for vintage baseball. I started as a VBB umpire in June of 2005. That was also my introduction to vintage baseball. I never played. I got into vintage as an umpire, and that's all I've ever done. If I hadn't been recruited into it, I probably never would have found vintage on my own. I was attracted to it for two reasons. I enjoy baseball and I love performing. Now, the first team manager to get me involved in vintage baseball found me through a local theater guild where I was pretty active at the time. I want you to think about that for a second. A theater guild is where he found me, not a place you normally associate with sports. This guy was pretty creative as a manager. He knew who he needed, and he figured out where to find me. This is a tip for you team captains and coordinators who are trying to find a team umpire. You don't necessarily want to look to your players. Now, don't take this the wrong way. I know there are a number of great vintage umpires out there who are also players. But I do also know this: a player would rather be playing. A lot of times when a player is acting as an umpire, they're taking a breather between matches or they're on the injured list. Unless you got a player who's shown a strong interest as an umpire, don't force it on somebody who'd really rather be playing. And I do apologize, I got a bit of a throat this morning. The other thing about having a player acting as umpire, sometimes a player who knows the game front to back might be lousy when it comes to explaining it to a stranger, let alone a group of strangers. If you've got a community theater or a Toastmasters chapter in your area, try to find somebody who's comfortable getting up and talking in front of a crowd. If they also happen to like baseball, you might wind up recruiting an umpire who will be with you for years and years, which is what happened with me. That first team I called for only lasted a couple of seasons. The players all quit, but I continued because I was having way too much fun. I didn't get out at all last season, and things have been kind of sluggish since the pandemic. But going back to 2005, I've called more than 400 vintage matches. Umpiring vintage has given me some amazing opportunities. I got to call a weekend of matches at the Field of Dreams in Dyersville, Iowa. I've been a guest presenter there at the Edison Ford Estate, as Kevin mentioned, in Fort Myers, Florida, which, if you haven't been, I highly recommend you get over and visit the Edison Ford Estate. Not only is it an amazing tour, but Tom Hatovi, who manages the place, is both a vintage player and a huge supporter of vintage baseball. I did get to call matches there on the spring training field that had once hosted Ty Cobb, which was very exciting. I've met many folks through the Ohio Cup in Columbus. I was a guest umpire there for 6 years in a row. If you're considering getting involved with VBBA as an umpire, I highly recommend it. The folks you'll meet are some of the best people in the world, and you get to enjoy some exciting and competitive baseball with a ringside seat. Now, it's important to note when I got into this, I didn't know anything about vintage baseball or historic baseball. And you might be saying, well, what's the difference? Well, this is my own shorthand, but it's an important distinction. It's how I think about what it is we're doing. There's historic baseball. It's the game we read about from back in the 1800s. Historic baseball is the game being chased by guys like John Thorne and David Block. They're trying to explain how the game evolved, who played it, where it was played, how it was played. Finding the details about historic baseball requires a lot of sleuthing and digging. Reading their work and seeing what they've discovered is incredibly interesting. Now, that's historic baseball. Then there's vintage baseball. Vintage is what we all do pretty much every weekend, from the first trees budding until the leaves have fallen. Vintage draws from historic baseball, but it's really not. There's no way it ever could be. Leather shoes, for one thing. Anybody here going to play in leather shoes? Well, of course not. That's why vintage can never be more than an attempt to approximate historic baseball. We all have to accept the fact vintage will never truly be historic baseball. It's always going to be kind of its own thing. And this doesn't mean we should just claim, we're playing vintage baseball and give up on trying to get it right. It means we have to be aware of our limitations when it comes to recreating and reporting on how it used to be. When I got into this, I was by no means a scholar of the game. I followed the Cardinals every year, but I had no knowledge about the pre-professional era, the Knickerbockers, or the gentleman's game. I'd seen Ken Burns' baseball, but it had been several years, and all that stuff is in part one. Who even remembers part one? Most people skip that DVD when they go back to rewatch. It took me a while, but I learned that the most important thing you can do as a vintage umpire is to educate yourself about the game and the era. I know that sounds pretty basic, but you'd be surprised. Excuse me. And when I say educate yourself, I don't mean ask the guy sitting next to you on the bench. He's as clueless as you are, but he won't admit it. When I started doing this, there were very few resources available to vintage clubs and especially vintage umpires. Plus, much of what was out there we now know to be either wrong, incomplete, or entirely falsified, as in the case of Mr. Doubleday. Is that Pig? Hi, Pig! I spent my first my first 4 or 5 seasons referring to myself as an arbiter. I make a face now saying that word, but I didn't then. It's what I'd been told I should call my position, and I accepted it as correct information. Why? Well, because someone who'd been in a club 6 months longer than I had said so. This is a very important point to keep in mind. Newbies trust the veterans. It's in our nature. We look to those with experience in order to learn the ropes. If the veterans had bad information, they're going to pass it on to the newbies. Eventually, the bad information becomes gospel. That's what was happening to me, but I didn't know it. I was eagerly soaking in all of this wildly wrong information about the gentleman's game, and of course, I was spreading what I was learning far and wide. In about 2010, I remember sitting in the bar at the Ohio Cup. I was taking on much-needed sustenance between matches. I distinctly remember talking to a guy who was telling me some very detailed bit of information about how they used to do it. After he'd gone on at length, I said, "So how do you know that?" And it wasn't a challenge. I was just wanting to get the same book or article that he'd read so I could get the same information. Well, he looked a bit confused, and finally he said, "I don't know. I guess somebody told me." I started asking that question. How do you know that? More and more often when I was attending vintage events. How do you know what they wore, what they said, how they stood on the field? Very few people pointed to history books as justification for their claims. Well, to be truthful, no one mentioned. I discovered that vintage baseball was fueled by its own grapevine of fairly inaccurate information. Some things were right, but a lot of things were pretty sketchy. In 2011, I did something huge. It changed my VBB life. I cracked open a book about the history of baseball. And I know that sounds somewhat elementary. I'm embarrassed to say it took me 5 years to do it, but I'm not alone. There are many very devoted vintage enthusiasts running around out there right now with a lot of bad information who've never opened a book about the subject. I've run into these people a lot. I see them almost every weekend all season long. Most of the time, they're the newest players on the club. They're so excited about this wonderful new hobby they're involved with, and they want to tell everybody. They're passing along bad info that they got word of mouth from the veteran players in the club. They don't want to be passing inaccurate info, but they don't know they're doing it. What they're hearing word of mouth may have started out as accurate, but it's being told and retold with errors and misinterpretations in the retelling. It's like a game of telephone, which results in dispersing bad information. I highly recommend to anyone who wants to be a vintage umpire or sideline interpreter, go to printed source material. Don't listen to what you're being told and accept it as fact. Find authors and historians who write about this stuff. Read a book or two about the gentleman's era of baseball. You need to go to trusted, historically accurate source material. It's the only way to eliminate the errors that come from retelling a story. There are a number of fantastic publications available as free PDF downloads from vbba.org. Eric Miklich's excellent book, The Rules of the Game, is a great place to start. It answers all of those when did they questions that you could possibly imagine. Now, if you're a VBB umpire, or you're hoping to get one for your club, here is a mantra to remember. Know a few things that are right rather than a whole lot of things that are wrong. And don't ever be afraid to say, I don't know. Saying I don't know is far preferable to passing along bad information. There is a learning curve to becoming a vintage umpire. You're not going to know everything overnight. Accept the limitations of what you know and keep studying. Add to your knowledge base slowly. Learn a few bedrock things, then branch out from there. By reading and rereading some of your most trusted source material, you're going to start to memorize some of the stories, the dates, and the events. Write out some simple timelines and commit them to memory. Learn some of the landmark dates, like the Knickerbocker rule set from 1845, the first NABBP convention. Learn the major changes between the rule sets, especially those rules where you call. This is where Eric Miklich's Rules of the Game is indispensable source material, and remember, it's a free download from vbba.org. Do not feel like you have to answer every question. This is one of the toughest things for a sideline interpreter. If you don't know something, again, don't be afraid to use that phrase, I don't know. Don't blow smoke. If they ask one that's not in your wheelhouse, just admit you don't know and move on. On the other side of the coin, you also don't want to blizzard your people with every bit of info that's lodged in your brain. You may be able to name every delegate to the 1857 convention, but think about your audience. Do they really want to hear a list like that? Even if you've got all of the details down, too much right info can be just as bad as dispensing bad info. As a sideline interpreter or umpire, it's important to consider your audience. Think about where you're running into these people. For me, I'm usually calling events being played on the weekend. A lot of times, matches are played in conjunction with a street festival or some historic celebration. This means your spectators, the audience which will benefit from your baseball knowledge, is made up of people who just happen to be wandering by. Don't forget that. They might pause for a minute to enjoy the men in the interesting costumes playing a game. The men and women in the interesting costumes playing a game that looks a little like baseball. They might wonder why it hit the ground, but the batter seemed to have been called out. You have to understand, getting an answer to that one question may be the full extent of their interest in what's going on. The folks in attendance especially Those weekend celebrations didn't sign up for a history class. They don't want to be lectured to or overloaded with information. They may have some interest in what's going on, but they didn't wander by hoping to be bombarded with a ton of minutia. As hard as this may be to hear, they don't care about this stuff as much as we do. They aren't going to remember a lot of what you say. So make what you say count and make it memorable. Make sure those things they do remember are correct. Your goal should be to have a spectator walk away from your match with one or two big and correct facts that they will remember and will be able to share later. It's a lot better than blasting them with 50 little details they can't recall 5 minutes after they walk away. Memorize a few dates, know a few firsts, but one of the best ways to connect with an audience is through anecdotal, true stories. You can tell them quickly and well, come up with a few of them. Certain historians do tell a good story. I like John Thorne for great anecdotes. That first book I mentioned reading was Thorne's Baseball in the Garden of Eden, The Secret History of the Early Game. I still get it out each season to reread and review my highlighted passages. When you find a story that you like, that could maybe be told in a couple of minutes, copy it from the source material and collect those stories. Put them in a notebook or a computer document. Learn them and learn how to tell them. Try to memorize details about them. Review them often during the season. I know I've forgotten a lot of mine. I'm going to be refreshing myself on the details before I get out to call this year. So how do you dispense these pearls of wisdom to an audience without being overbearing? Well, make yourself both visible and available. If you aren't a player, don't umpire in street clothes. Create a costume for yourself. Even though you may not be in a uniform, your style of dress should stand out so they know you're part of the presentation. I perform in the style of an 1860s Civil War era Illinois businessman. I'd most likely be a respected member of a well-established frontier community, and it's possible I might also be a financial contributor to a baseball club. I'm a lover of the sport, but my playing days are behind me. I enjoy helping out as umpire when the boys get together with another club. This is my character backstory for the umpire, Honest Al Stair. It's who I am and why I would be out with a baseball team on a Sunday afternoon. There are very few resources for team uniforms and even fewer for umpire outfits. I got pointers on my costume by calling the Lincoln Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois to ask a few questions. I chose it because it was somewhat local to me at the time and it covered the historical era I was interested in. For solid information about the era, look up a Civil War museum and give them a call. If you explain to them what you're doing, get ready for a ton of help. Museums love to talk about this kind of stuff. I wear a short top hat because of my conversation with a Civil War era clothing expert. As you go further east, you'll notice umpires tend to have taller top hats and wear more formal dress than I do. Here in the areas of Illinois and Missouri during the late 1850s, we understood style, but we didn't put on airs like those Easterners. By creating a costume, you're also helping create a character. I love playing Honest Al. I've performed as Honest Al long enough to have created a fairly detailed backstory. A lot of my backstory is purely for laughs. If you can get people laughing, you can get them to listen to you. I'm always running a con. A favorite of mine, my brother recently took over an abandoned silver mine in Minnesota. He has information that it was not mined out, and he's sure to hit an undiscovered vein any day now. I can get you in on the ground floor if you're interested. Shares are only $5 each. Talk to me after the match. It's Branson level hokey, but it's a fun way to interact with the audience, and it makes you memorable and accessible. Have a few bits ready to go and have some fun with the spectators. I love to work the crowd before a match in character, doing improv with the livelier members of the group. Getting out in the crowd, letting them interact with you, makes you more approachable later. If you have a question during a match, they're going to feel more comfortable talking to the guy who was joking around with them beforehand. If you're aloof or standoffish as an umpire, the audience is less likely to ask you any questions. Besides making yourself visible, don't forget the available part. If you have questions about what you're watching, let me know. Also, let them know this would be one of those places where vintage baseball diverges from historic baseball. Historically, umpires were isolated from the spectators. The reason was very pragmatic. It was to prevent payoffs from gamblers who wanted a certain team to win. This is also a great little anecdote to throw in while explaining that some of what you're doing isn't always going to be historically accurate. If your crowd of spectators is made up of the usual team families, you aren't going to have a lot of questions. They already know what's going on. If you're getting passersby, they'll stop and they'll ask. They're probably going to ask about the cosmetic things first. Vintage doesn't look exactly right to somebody who's used to watching modern baseball, and they'll want to know why. Have a quick answer ready for the one-bound rule and why the pitcher throws it like that. They're going to want to know why you aren't calling strikes and balls, assuming that's your rule set. If there's enough equipment, have a bat and a ball handy just to use for show and tell with the crowd. In nearly 20 years of umpiring, I'd have to say the number one question I'm ever asked about is the ball. Being able to toss them one for inspection answers a lot of questions. No sizes and weights. How do you learn the rules governing the correct size and weight of a baseball during any given historic season? Well, one more time, a shout out for Eric Miklich's Rules of the Game. I like to compare what we're using for a vintage match to a modern ball. The modern ball gives most people a frame of reference. So point out the difference in the stitch pattern and how a vintage ball usually feels squishier than a machine-wound ball. One ball would not only be used for an entire match, sometimes one ball would last the better part of a season. The ball was a valuable, unique, handmade commodity in the gentleman's era, and people like hearing about it. Learn some information about the bats being used. For some reason, equipment and the evolution of equipment fascinates most people. Fun fact, I enjoy pointing out the rules in my era only restrict the diameter, not the length of the bat. You can find stories about 6'8" guys wielding 48 and 50-inch bats. This is what I mean when I say memorize a few quick stories you can tell with authority. A 6'8" player swinging a 50-inch bat is a visual, anecdotal story I've actually had a spectator remember from one season to the next. As you get better and better at the sideline interpreting thing, you're going to realize you can't be everywhere on the sidelines and calling the match all at once. You need to enlist the help of your club. Now, it may sound hokey, but I believe every person who puts on a vintage uniform and competes in a vintage match is an ambassador of. It's your responsibility, even as a player, to at least be able to answer some of the basic questions about the game and answer them correctly. If you can, it's also important you learn to use that all-powerful phrase, "I don't know." I'm registered as an umpire with the VBB, and I will work for any team who needs me. I'm no longer in the area, but for many years I was associated with the Springfield, Illinois Long Nine, and I consider them to be my home club. And hide a pig in the gang from the Long Nine who are in Fort Myers. The Long Nine have been great about putting up with my umpire learning curve over the years. As I discover new information, I share it with them, and we all try to incorporate it into our matches. They still slip with an arbiter or a crank reference now and then, but they are trying. I appreciate how much they've worked to get it right over the years. One of the neat things that kind of developed with the Long Nine was a sense of hierarchy when it came to answering spectator questions. I kind of compare it to customer service departments. For most things, anyone can handle it. The guys know bat and ball questions, glove questions, general play and rules. They're able to handle a lot of audience interaction on their own because they're armed with correct information. Anytime I learn something important that might be different from something we've been doing, I make sure to share it with the team. They understand I've been studying the history and the era. I've kind of set myself up as the quote-unquote expert for the club. So now if they get a question that's beyond their scope, they hand it off to me. I'll hear a "Hey Al" from a player waving me over to a spectator with some offbeat question. Sometimes I can answer it, but a lot of the time I have to tell them, I don't know. It's what you get when you're working with a bunch of amateur historians / baseball players. It's also important, to keep the scope of what you should know in mind. Unless you're getting into some of the later 19th century rule sets, we're primarily attempting to portray an umpire from the gentleman's era or the amateur era of baseball. This era covers roughly the 30-year period from 1839 through 1869. The Cincinnati Red Stockings ushered in the professional era starting in 1870. Don't get sucked into the professional era by spectators who think you're baseball Google. When asked about certain professional firsts, like who had the first home run or who was the first designated hitter, I fall back on the line, if it happened after 1869, I wouldn't know. Share and repeat correct and accurate information with your team so they will learn it. Those stories and anecdotes I mentioned earlier, make sure the team knows a few as well. Some of your players will have heard your spiel at matches, so they'll start to incorporate some of your stories into their sideline patter. Listen over their shoulder every now and then to make sure they're getting the details right. This can be tough, but try to rein in those overly talkative players. These are the excited players, newest usually on the team. Their head is filled with a few things they were told and a few things they've seen. They tend to fill in the rest, and rarely none of it's right. A lot of times you can hear when an overly talkative player is moving away from what they're comfortable with. There'll be a change in their voice, even their body language, as they veer away from known information and skate off into smoke-blowing territory. Stop them before the smoke starts and try to get them back on the right track when it comes to accurate information. Using your club as an extension of your instruction can be very valuable. Foster this idea about getting it right. Also prepare them for things to sometimes change. A lot of what we once thought we knew about historic baseball is changing, and that's thanks to new sources for research. One of the most interesting and exciting things to come out of the digital age is the digitizing of old newspapers. Historians of all types are now able to use actual newspaper archives to research historic events. Since about 2000, baseball historians have been combing through dozens of sporting newspapers that used to exist on the East Coast. These ancient archives have been scanned and are now searchable. Baseball historians have unearthed amazing details about the formation and play of baseball clubs that predate the Knickerbocker rule set. This research means that what we know is always changing. Make sure your players understand how dynamic the knowledge base is when it comes to what we know about historic baseball. It's very possible that a fact you know today will be changed by some new information discovered tomorrow. It can be hard to let go of something you thought was true. I have a talk that I do about the myth of Abner Doubleday. I tie it all back to Doc Adams and the gentleman's era where the game was truly invented and evolved. I've given this presentation at retirement homes where I swear there were some gentlemen in the crowd ready to punch me. They had read about Abner Doubleday inventing baseball in history books when they were in grade school. Just because some know-it-all in a top hat says it isn't true doesn't change a thing for these guys. Don't let your players get in a rut when it comes to recognizing and accepting new information. Keeping your club armed with the most correct and current information can be a challenge, but it will definitely pay off throughout the season. What we're doing as vintage umpires and sideline interpreters is a cross between a lecture and a show. You're trying hard to be a good teacher. You want to make sure your students are getting the right information. Do your best. Don't beat yourself up if you aren't getting through to them. Unlike most teachers, our students can get up and walk out of class anytime they want. That's where the show comes in. In order to get the information to them, you have to try to keep them there. So be fun, be entertaining, in my case, be loud, because that's how you're going to get your students to listen to you. It's my time on umpiring for vintage baseball. If anyone has any questions, we're going to try and do any questions.
Questions? Tim?
Yeah, I guess as far as the umpire aspect goes, typically how many pitches do you allow before you start calling balls, strikes, that kind of thing, like warnings, like how many, does that make sense?
Yeah, and in 400 matches, and we're talking about Doc Adams actually made it okay to call a strike in 1857, 1858. And it was to move the game along. But the truth was, he was the only one who was brave enough to call the strike because everybody else considered it really rude to do. I have never been in a situation where I've had a player who was taking pitch after pitch after pitch after pitch where I really had to step in and say something. It's just not normally with vintage play. I'm seeing guys swing. They want to swing. They want to hit. So we don't have a lot of them that are delaying the game or taking a ton of pitches. I have once or twice had it happen where it's pretty obvious the batter's not stepping in for some reason and taking a swing, and I will mention it. Normally, if I just say, batters are a problem. Is there something you need done, with the delivery of the ball? Why are you not striking it? You need to hit the ball. And normally say something like that, they're going to hit it in the next one or two pitches. So I've really never had an issue with that. You can read historic accounts of players, delaying games for hours, taking pitch after pitch after pitch after pitch, and an umpire wouldn't step in usually because he had some kind of financial stake in the match. So no, it's not anything I've ever really had a problem with.
Okay, thank you.
Al's good at moving the game along.
Never heard of
He makes his stuff up there and get going.
Let's keep it going. I gotta get to a beer.
There you go.
It's great, Al. We really appreciate the perspective, and especially with our clubs down here in Florida. We're newbies at all this, so we're trying to do things, evolve and learn as we go along. You were a good example when you were down here a couple years ago, so this will be a great resource for people to check out. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thanks for having me.
All right, take care now.
Have a safe season, everybody.
Thanks.
Somewhere.
Somewhere.